Hello, everybody. Welcome to Tortoise's regular Friday lunchtime Sensemaker live thinking in partnership with Santander. Thank you very much, Santander. This is where slow news and conventional news collide, I like to think. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and I feel today, as I'm sure we all do at times, a bit like a frog in a frying pan. You will be aware of the famous experiment in which the poor frogs get hotter and hotter until it's too late to jump out. I'm not really feeling that sorry for myself, but I just sort of deploy the analogy in reference to the news, the rolling news, which these past 2 weeks has been relentless. We've had something close to, if not actual, insurrection in the US. Compelling TV, but also of massive global importance. We're in the middle of an historic and horrendously costly pandemic. And in the meantime, trudging along underneath everything, the UK and Europe are engaged in a long-running and immensely complex divorce, which we didn't want to forget about, which is why the question that we're addressing in relation to Brexit today is what's really happening with trade on the front line and also behind the scenes. And this is, apart from anything, an opportunity for everybody on the call to pitch in with any personal experiences they've had of Brexit. I don't mean sort of impressions, but actual concrete experiences that you can describe to us. So far, we have heard about, and this is just a very quick list that I've written. I mean, picking up on this morning's news, the FT's exclusive on the UK's plans to revisit the whole question of workers' rights and tear up the Working Time Directive. We hear of breeders of glass eels in Gloucestershire finding they no longer have a market in Europe. Scottish salmon exporters finding their salmon held up. Lorry drivers' sandwiches confiscated at the border because they contain ham and cheese that now need special checks. A quite alarming tweet thread yesterday about a Polish lorry driver being given the runaround all around Kent until his Kent permit expired, and he then had to fork out hundreds of pounds. A sharp fall in EU stock trading in London, and an exodus of people, again reported in the FT, ostensibly attributable to COVID, but interesting to know if Brexit is also a factor there. So what I hope that we can get at today is sort of beyond the anecdotal to a better, clearer vision of the big picture. I mean, it feels as if there hasn't been a catastrophe so far, but are we missing anything, or were we overly anxious beforehand? Before I go any further, the drill for those of you who may not be aware of it, a Think-In is an expanded editorial conference. We're all in the newsroom together. Loosely enforced and easily misunderstood rule is no questions. It just means pitch in, tell us what you think. You don't have to couch it as a question. It means nobody has to answer, and we get through more points of view. You can do this in two ways. In the chat, my colleague Zab Greenwood is in there with you, and I will try to keep an eye as well, or by raising your electronic hand, as Paul Atherton has already done. Well done, Paul. I promise we will get to you. You do that in the new version of Zoom by clicking on reactions, and then you can see the raise hand sign. Let me first very briefly, by the way, when you do that, let me bring up participants. Yes, so Paul's got his hand up. Just as a quick poll, how many of the people in the room have personally felt the impact of Brexit? Well, you don't have to be an exporter, but thanks a lot. And I don't mean just in sort of feeling anxious about the news? I mean, in personal, concrete ways. Okay. So a good dozen, but at the moment, not more than that. Okay. Well, look, it'd be great to be able to come back to some of you if you'd like to talk about that with us later. But first, I wanted to come to Raoul Ruparel, who is a former advisor to the PM on Brexit, and now at Deloitte advises Deloitte clients on Brexit, mainly in relation to trade, but other things too. And Raoul is, I don't want to make him blush, but as someone who's observed from afar, one of the most insightful and even-handed commentators on Twitter, at any rate, on this, bar none. So very good of you to join us. Thank you. When the deal was published just after Christmas, you gave your initial take on it, I suspect at greater length to some people, but on Twitter in a thread in which you described, and I'm condensing that to 3 words: balanced but defensive on both sides. 2 weeks in, what is your overall picture of the impact of Brexit so far on trade, broadly defined? And just with one other note, is it possible at all to disentangle Brexit from the impact of COVID, since it's all happening at the same time?
Sure, thanks. Well, hopefully everyone can hear me, and thanks for having me here. I mean, a big question to start, so I'll try and give a few high-level thoughts that will hopefully spur some discussion. I think, look, the challenges we're seeing in relation to trade and some of the impacts, I think, are, very much what we would have expected given the type of agreements that was reached, but also I think, to be honest, that for those of us who've been following it for the past year, would have expected given where things have been heading for some time. I think on the day-to-day basis, in my work with Deloitte and with clients there, the main areas we're seeing questions are around rules of origin, VAT, and then on agri-food and all of the related additional SPS checks, that sanitary and phytosanitary checks, and the paperwork there. We are seeing some companies having real challenges, but I don't think the material impact on trade flows has been quite as large as might have been expected, as you sort of hinted at there, Giles. I think, though, we will really only be able to judge in the next couple of weeks. Trade flows have been depressed due to sort of stockpiling pre-Christmas, the fact that it's been Christmas and New Year, and then also obviously COVID. So I think there is an expectation that trade flows are going to increase over the next few weeks, and therefore we might see more disruption, and at least the absolute level of disruption will probably increase before it gets better. We are obviously also seeing some particular disruption around Northern Ireland and Ireland, and again, I think this was expected. On the Northern Irish side, I mean, it's just simply the number of different systems, and even with various easements and mitigations, the fact these came so late and taking advantage of them has proven quite challenging, and just a lack of time to prepare and test is really posing problems for business. So, I mean, nothing particularly surprising here. I think I often get asked if these are teething problems or if these are things that are here to stay. I think it's a combination of the two. Some of this is teething problems in the sense that people just aren't used to doing these checks and paperwork, and as they get more used to doing that, the processes will improve, they'll become more streamlined, and there'll be fewer mistakes, which ultimately people turning up at the borders with incorrect paperwork is really what causes this disruption. But of course, all of these changes are basically permanent and are here to stay. So while people might get better at doing these, filling out necessary forms, doing all the necessary customs paperwork, ultimately the need to do them will remain, and that's going to be a permanent cost to business and a permanent, additional cost within their supply chain, and an additional cost in terms of admin and potentially delays. I think we have seen some people calling for already renegotiation of various parts of the deal. My view, for what it's worth, is that a lot of the problems we're seeing are not down to negotiating errors or mistakes or the fact this was rushed, but are basically by design and are an outcome of the type of agreement we have. I think it's inevitable if you have a pretty thin free trade agreement, that you are going to have these issues around rules of origin, that you are going to have these issues around customs, around VAT, around agri-food. And I don't think there is therefore much more that can be done in the negotiating space to solve these. I think we are more likely to see some unilateral mitigations potentially on both sides. The Prime Minister has already spoken about compensation for Scottish fishermen and things like that. So we could see more schemes coming down the track in that sense. There are things they could do on either side in terms of grace periods and extending the grace period that's in place for Northern Ireland currently for the supermarkets. That's possible, but I think again, this was an outcome of a lengthy negotiation. I think both sides knew the challenges around agri-food. The UK made a very clear request for a trusted trader type scheme in Northern Ireland on trade from Great Britain to Northern Ireland for agri-food, and that wasn't achieved in the negotiation. And it's not clear to me why that would be achieved now.
And it wasn't achieved because the EU didn't want it. Is that right?
So on that specifically, the trusted trader regime would have required, so what they were looking for was derogations from EU law to limit the number of export health certificates that were required per sort of mixed consignment, essentially. And that was rejected by the EU. You can say fairly because it is quite a big thing, but obviously, it was rejected, and I don't see the EU position changing on that. Sinn Féin and the DUP came out jointly in support of that, and it still didn't shift the dial. So I think it's quite hard to see that changing in that sense. So, broadly, I'm not expecting huge things to change to solve any of the challenges we're seeing now, really, unfortunately. So I think that's what we have to expect, and this disruption is going to continue. And I think the key question will be what happens as trade returns to more normal levels. Mm-hmm. And of course, we've only seen this disruption in terms of trade borders. Once people start moving around, we're going to see disruption in terms of movement of people as well. So that's still to come. And then, of course, we have eventually the UK will put in place its own border, because at the moment that's not really fully there. And so from July we'll have that. So, there are different things to come down the line. And I think I'll leave it there for opening remarks.
That's fascinating, and it leaves my head spinning. I want to channel right away a question from Anthony Cope. He says, what about the unwinding of friction? But specifically mentions, and I hadn't seen this, just today another EU haulier is pulling out of the UK delivery market. I put that to you because, as I recall, in your initial analysis of the deal, you were sort of positively surprised by the progress on road haulage. Am I right? And if so, is this a surprise to you that EU hauliers should be pulling out?
So I think I was surprised they managed to avoid having any permits required for hauliers, which, it's not necessarily, I don't want to overstate it in the sense that it was enough to avoid this kind of thing happening, but it's better than it could have been, I guess, was where I was coming from. And I think, that if they had to have additional permits, it would have made this kind of thing even more likely, I think. So in that sense, that's why I think it was positive. But obviously the challenges inherent in the rules of origin, the customs paperwork, are still clearly causing significant problems for hauliers, as we would have expected them to. In terms of the EU hauliers stopping, so I think what's interesting is that there's been a lot of focus on the lack of preparedness on the UK side, but I think this highlights that there is, a lack of preparedness on both sides, but also just the inherent challenges in preparing for something with such short notice. And so in that sense, it isn't that surprising that, EU hauliers are struggling, although stopping movements entirely is quite a significant step that I hadn't necessarily expected a large company to take. But I think it does demonstrate that, while the focus is on the UK in terms of preparedness, there are real challenges for EU businesses here as well, and on the EU side.
Right, thank you. Let me go to Maddy Thimont Jack from the Institute for Government. You had a busy Christmas too, as I recall. I suspect you were furiously reading through that deal all through Christmas Day. Well, if you can pick out what's gone surprisingly well and what's gone surprisingly badly for you, sort of looking as if from low Earth orbit at Britain since then.
In the sense sort of how the deal has sort of played out in practice?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I mean, luckily we did take Christmas Day off, so we read it on Boxing Day, and it wasn't just me, it was the wider team at the IFG, so I can't claim all credit. But I mean, I think
it was very nicely put so that we could think that you had been slaving all the way through. But there you go.
But in terms of sort of, I guess, what's gone well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that I've sort of been observing, and I think this sort of picks up a bit on what Raoul's already said, is the sort of interaction between COVID and Brexit in terms of seeing the reality on the ground. So I think one of the sort of interesting aspects of this is the fact that some of the reporting suggests that the delays that we are seeing in Kent, a lot of that's actually coming from the COVID tests for drivers rather than the new arrangements with the EU, and actually that most of the sort of trucks arriving in Kent do have the right paperwork, although there are some issues when they sort of get across the channel and then they haven't quite filled it in correctly from the French perspective. And I think that's really interesting for sort of a couple of different reasons, because I think on the one hand, it sort of almost gives the impression that everything's sort of fine and it's going quite well down there. And I think we shouldn't sort of jump to that conclusion quite so quickly. As Raoul's already said, you know, the level of trade is quite severely reduced at the moment, both because of COVID, but also because a lot of businesses, I think, are waiting to see what happens, and they're still digesting this deal that landed on Christmas Eve, and they're sort of reluctant to sort of get stuck in until they have a better grip of what's going on. And I think related to that, the sort of other thing that we've heard quite a lot is that sort of quite a lot of hauliers are just reluctant to pick up goods because they're not sure that there is the right paperwork, and they don't want to get stuck in the sort of traffic in Kent. And I think the sort of experience for Christmas, where we did see all those lorries lined up at Manson Airport and other places, has sort of traumatized hauliers, where they actually just don't want to risk that again. So I do think there's a sort of dual impact here, where there's a waiting to see what happens, there's a not wanting to get caught up in the COVID challenges at the border, but also not wanting to be sort of held responsible for not having the right paperwork. And so I feel like, you know, so far it seems sort of okay, but I do think that could change. But what's going to be really interesting is, when does it change? Because this is where the sort of, again, the COVID impact comes in, where sort of, you know, there isn't as much retail going on. We haven't, you know, there is sort of the demand for goods in the UK is not as high, or GB anyway, is not as high. Well, no, for the UK, but in terms of GB EU border, it's not as high as you'd expect normally. And so I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that then plays out. And then sort of related to that, sort of not just in terms of trade and goods, you know, we haven't talked about the fact there are obviously new barriers to trade and services. And again, because of COVID, we're not seeing companies sending people across Europe in the same way to deliver services. So we're not going to see them brushing up against some of those new rules in quite the same way. And I think that that's going to be, again, really interesting to see, where, you know, a lot of the big service providers are going to be very aware of the rule changes, but for sort of smaller SMEs who haven't sort of got the capacity to, or sort of the expertise to understand quite what's changing for them, I think that's where we'll see whether they sort of get caught up in some of those new rules. And sort of related to that, and that's not just, you know, this isn't sort of, if we're interpreting trade very broadly, if we're talking about movement of people, that's also true for people going on holiday and not having the right, you know, forgetting to take their pet to the vet 10 days before they travel to get an animal health certificate, and then therefore getting to the French border and being told, no, you can't take your dog into France. You know, these are the sorts of things that people are going to start realizing that I think sort of haven't sort of materialized yet. So I'm quite interested, I guess, to sort of, I'm a bit of a wait and see, and let's see how this unfolds. But I do think in terms of the things that haven't gone as well, and I mean, I think really we've already talked about it, but there's obviously is a concern that certain sort of providers have sort of, I think DPD suspended moving goods between GB and the EU for a period of time, because they're sort of, they don't want to get caught up in the traffic. I think Debenhams have also done that. There are other, I think someone in the chat talked about a company from Germany not wanting to ship to GB. You know, there are going to be these sorts of business decisions being made. And I think for some of them, it's a question of, is this a temporary decision while you sort of start figuring out what the new rules are, or is this a permanent one? And then the other sort of, you know, the example that picked up quite a lot of attracted quite a lot of attention this week was Percy Pigs going to Ireland, and the sort of the UK or GB acting as a distribution centre for goods, where if a good is imported into the GB, and then there isn't enough sufficient sort of processing done to them, they don't qualify for the rules of origin requirements to be able to sort of move them back into another part of the EU. And that's sort of one of the problems with Percy Pigs. And there's a discussion about, well, you can probably change that. You can sort of take the Percy Pigs sort of destined for Ireland, you can move them through in transit through GB, but this is still a change for business model. It's still going to cost money to sort of change how you're operating. And so I think it's these sorts of decisions that are going to sort of slowly unfold over the next few months, which are going to be less visible, but will be quite significant for those businesses having to make them.
Maddy, one of my jobs is to admit my ignorance. The whole Percy Pig thing passed me by. Can you just go very briefly back to the beginning there? What are they, and are they stuck somewhere?
So Percy Pigs, the sort of Marks and Spencer sweet that is relatively.
Okay, so I thought this was live pork. All right.
No. These are sweets. As I say, I mean they're sort of so basically the issue has been that Percy Pigs that we produce them. They're produced in Germany. They're imported into GB, and then they're moved on to Ireland, to M&S in Ireland. And basically, because when they're imported into GB, not enough happens to them to sort of say that they are sort of originating in GB in the UK, then they're incurring costs when they're moving into Ireland. And so it's a very small, but as I say, for at least some people, quite an important sort of example of what the reality of this looks like. And sort of, as I say, this question, and I think again someone else put it in the chat, the sort of question of, can GB continue to be a sort of distribution centre for some of these goods? And it's a sort of bigger question, I think, that we
don't know yet. Right. Okay. Thank you. Andrew Girdwood, I see you in the chat. We are definitely coming to the Scottish angle. But first, I want to come to Paul Colgan, who's joined us from Dublin, economics correspondent with Virgin Media Television. Thank you so much. From where you're sitting, Paul, I mean, you have many preoccupations besides empty shelves in Northern Ireland, but do they look to you like a blip or a sign of things to come?
They also look like a bit of an exaggeration sometimes, I think. I don't think it has sunk in yet to many people that the island of Ireland is now a single unit. Northern Ireland is still in the single market. And I think it has come to a surprise to many people here just how unprepared it seems big UK retailers have been. Now, it may be part due to the fact that the deal wasn't struck until Christmas Eve, but from this side of the Irish Sea, the clear messaging from government and state agencies for a long time had been, look, you're not going to get this comprehensive free trade agreement at the end of the year. It is going to be a very thin agreement. So everybody knew or suspected they knew what the shape of the overall deal was going to be coming into 2021. Yet we have these instances where Percy Pig, for example, can't make his way to Ireland. And that's emblematic of some of the issues Marks and Spencer's have been having. And indeed, to a lesser extent, Tesco, they've discovered that some of their ready meals are causing them issues in terms of getting them onto Irish shelves. But there's, I suppose, if you look north of the border, yes, there does seem to have been more empty shelves, but that seems to be more due to the fact that those specific retailers, such as Asda and Sainsbury's, don't have a presence south of the border. They don't have a distribution network across the island of Ireland. And that is partly to blame why they have empty shelves. You look at Lidl, for example, who have big warehouses around Dublin, who manage Ireland as a single unit. They've no issues north of the border. Indeed, yesterday, Lidl Northern Ireland tweeted out photographs of their shelves and said, this is what happens when you prepare for Brexit. We've been preparing for 2 years. We've been looking at our supply chain, and we've ensured that we've sourced goods locally and that we can get boats essentially from France to bring goods through Southern Ireland into the north of Ireland. So it's all tied up in confusion, and I think the lateness of the deal, and there's a lot of political noise. The DUP in particular is aggressively pushing a line that this is to do with the Northern Ireland Protocol. They want it gone. They want to see the introduction of Article 16. Their own political point of view plays into this analysis. If you look at manufacturing Northern Ireland, they are on the complete opposite side to the DUP. They say these are teething issues. These are issues that will be dealt with in due course. People aren't going to be starving. You're not going to see empty shelves from here to eternity. So there's a lot of politics tied up in this, but there's also a lack of preparation. Now, some of these issues may well be teething issues. Now, Dublin Port, for example, has seen less than half the volume it was expecting to see in the first 2 weeks of the year. And I think that's because many UK retailers and distributors are sitting back, waiting to see what happens. I know, speaking from my own point of view, I ordered 2 books on Amazon last Monday. They were due for delivery last Thursday. They still haven't arrived. If you ask Amazon what's happened to them, they say your parcel may have been lost, but if you go to track it, you find that it's sitting in a warehouse somewhere in England right now. And that is replicated right around the country. Online deliveries in Ireland have been held up significantly over the past 2 weeks, since Christmas, since Brexit kicked in. Now, COVID may be playing a part, but it's rules of origin, it's lack of preparation, and so on. So we'll see over the next couple of weeks, for example, what happens at Dublin Port. But what you are seeing is supply chains changing in real time. I'll give you an example. There's a big ferry out of Dublin called the WB Yeats. It belongs to Irish Ferries, a massive ferry. It should this week be doing Dublin Holyhead in terms of freight. And then when it kicks into the tourism season from April, it reverts to Cherbourg. This week it's doing Dublin Cherbourg because Irish hauliers are going direct to Cherbourg. They're not using the land bridge. They don't want to use the land bridge. It adds 4 hours to their journey to the continent, but they're prepared and they're happy to do that to avoid what is happening in Britain. So this is what's happening in real time. They had been preparing to do this. This is not something COVID inspired, though many Irish hauliers were obviously caught up in that before Christmas. This is a long-term plan, and hauliers are beginning to implement it.
That's completely fascinating. Thank you. Worth the price of admission just for that. Paul, while we've got you, you draw the contrast between Lidl and, for example, Tesco. Are there any legal/structural obstacles to big UK retailers setting up an Ireland-wide distribution network so that ultimately they fill their Belfast shelves from Dublin?
So there's nothing to stop them. Specifically in terms of distribution, I think it's Asda and Sainsbury's who operate in Northern Ireland, but not in the Republic of Ireland. They had to replace some of their products with locally sourced ones at the start of the year. And I think that reflects the fact that unlike Lidl, they don't have that all island distribution network. So they're relying on stuff coming into Belfast and Larne from Liverpool and Holyhead, as opposed to coming from France, taking the long way around. So,
and just to be clear, when you say locally sourced, you mean from the island of Ireland, broadly defined. So quite possibly south of the Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland border.
Yes, both jurisdictions are still in the single market.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to stop them doing that. I think it's just a fact that perhaps they listen to political promises when they shouldn't have. But I find it difficult to explain why a German retailer such as Lidl is having no issues, yet UK retailers in Northern Ireland are having issues. And in the Republic of Ireland,
the chat suggests that that's precisely because they're German.
But domestic Irish retailers aren't having an issue. SuperValu and Dunn's, their shelves are fully stocked.
Right.
So if they can do it in one part of the island, why can't retailers do it in another part of the island? So I think what you're seeing is realization, the logical outworking of the fact that the island of Britain is now a third country and the island of Ireland is within the single market. And it's going to take time for people to get their heads around that, but it will happen.
Right. Thank you so much. In a second, Zav, let's go back to your slides and have a quick go through them again in case there's stuff that we missed just before we started. But Paul, you've been so patient with your hand up. Let's come to you first. What did you want to say?
Hi, John. It's been quite interesting for me. I've got a few friends that have been impacted by this. And other friends who haven't. So they're both sort of small businesses that are retailing both here in the UK and across Europe. One is a skincare business, and she's managed to get all her paperwork sorted out, and that's all been addressed and had no problems at all. And the other is a chocolate manufacturer, and she supplies sort of vegan chocolates through the Holland and Barrett chain. And she's had all her products in Europe, which is under a different banner to the Holland and Barrett in UK, pulled from their shelves with 24 hours notice. And I've also found myself in a very interesting trap with PayPal.
You know, on what grounds?
Too much paperwork, they cited.
Too much paperwork just to sell them?
Yeah. So
Okay.
obviously the export of these goods require new paperwork that they previously didn't have. Right. And they've cited that now as a stall to getting them into the stores, and therefore they said there's a cost that they're not prepared to bear.
Fascinating, thank you. Zav, let's just have a quick look at those slides again in case there's stuff that we missed.
Yeah, I think Phoebe will get them up for me. Yeah, so I'll just whiz through these because it's mainly complementing what's already been said. So obviously, the deal which Johnson announced, he'd been kind of touting as a Canada-style deal. Obviously, you know, one of the big problems is that Canada has a very different trading relationship to the EU than the UK does, and a much smaller one, which obviously invites the question, was it ever a good point of comparison? As you can see here, the UK's total imports, 53% of them come to the EU, its total exports, 45% go to the EU, whereas Canada's relationship to the EU, as you can see from the 10.5% and the 7.9%, is much smaller. It's also worth saying that Boris Johnson was selling the deal as zero tariff, zero quota. Canada's arrangement with the EU is in zero tariff or zero quota. So it was never a very good comparison. Then if we go to the next slide, this is just trying to give a bit of texture to what's expected to happen in Dover and what is happening. So obviously two quite large numbers, the £215 million, the estimated new custom declarations that will be needed for British businesses, and the 7.5 billion, the estimated cost of extra bureaucracy. In terms of actual disruption, the Department for Transport says that 90% of lorries crossing the channel have had the right paperwork in the first week. The Road Haulage Association gives a slightly different figure, saying that 1 in 5 trucks were being turned away. And the ferry company DFDS was saying that they were experiencing a lot of vehicles being refused and delayed. As Raoul has said, and as Maddy has said, the crossing has been a lot quieter than it normally is, probably down to stockpiling in December. And so we may see it getting worse next month when those stockpiles begin to run out. Then if we go to the next slide. I think I just wanted to give this as a kind of quick case study of how the UK's new trading relationship is changing life for British businesses. So this is an example which was in the FT, Renee Watson, who runs quite a small business making science kits for children, because the UK has new safety marks and because she now has to satisfy EU regulators and UK regulators, she needs to pay to certify her products. That's costing her £500 per product. And because she stocks 36 different types of products, she needs to spend around £20,000 on compliance. And so for some businesses, there are kind of big new costs. Then if we go to the next slide, this is just a bit of a picture of what's going on in the city. So EU companies can no longer trade European stocks from London because financial services were largely left out of the agreement. It's only British and non-EU investors, and I think maybe Swiss investors now, which can still trade EU shares from London. You can see that there was a big loss of shares to EU venues. This is a kind of representative day, the 6th of January. On the first 2 trading days after the Brexit deal, these venues were trading around half of the amount of business that they normally would be. There's been a big drop. The thing that's worth saying is that it's not necessarily a massive issue for the UK. The majority of taxes in the share trading industry are paid on the revenues the trading venues reports rather than the trades. And the city had done pretty well at preparing for no deal just in case that came about. So at the moment, it's been fairly resilient. And then the final slide, obviously we've been talking about the Irish Sea. As Paul mentioned, Northern Ireland is still in the EU single market, and so it has different regulatory and customs arrangements to the rest of the UK. And I think what we were told before and what is happening now is kind of quite well encapsulated by these 4 quotes. So Boris Johnson was quite bullish in saying there was never going to be checks. And then obviously we've got Fordham and Mason saying they can't deliver to Northern Ireland. John Lewis, Decathlon, Debenhams, TK Maxx, other retailers have had to pause their service. And again, Michael Gove just last month saying, I don't think there's a border in the Irish Sea. And him saying just a week or so ago, the situation will get worse before it gets better. And as mentioned, lots of supermarkets in Northern Ireland, which don't have distribution centres in the Republic, have been struggling to import fresh food from Britain. And that's the slides.
Great, thank you very much, Zav. I love the way you focus on Fortnum's there, not being able to get through. I'm sure they'll find a way. In the time that we have left, I want to do this. In a second, I'm going to invite those who raise their hands to cite personal experiences to raise them again, and anybody who will rapid fire will go through and hear what some of them were. Before that, I want to ask Jane Mays if she can explain how from Cumbria you're going to take advantage of both jurisdictions when Scotland rejoins the EU. And after that, we're going to come back to Raoul and Maddy and Paul, assuming we have time. But so first, job number 1, Jane, you say in the chat, in Cumbria, we're looking forward to Scottish independence and EU membership so we can be in both jurisdictions like Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Are you planning to move from Cumbria to Scotland or not?
No. There'll have to be a buffer zone. Maybe the whole of the rest, maybe the whole of England can be that buffer zone. It arose from something that Gove said about Northern Ireland being in a very positive position.
Right.
So that's my reaction. We are looking forward to it.
I see elsewhere in the chat, was it Andrew or Anthony speaking about what started as a joke? It was Andrew, yes, becoming less of a joke, ideas of the Celtic Union. Andrew, are you starting to take that seriously? Andrew?
Yes, it was a joke, but I've heard it mentioned by separate groups of friends multiple times this year already. And as alluded to already on this conversation, we're already a bit closer there with Ireland. Ireland is one island now.
Yeah.
It's believable. I have challenged my nationalist friends. How can you be pro-Celtic Union and still a nationalist, Scottish nationalist? And they kind of deflect that. And the choice is, well, in their head, would you rather be part of the Westminster traditional UK, or would you build something afresh from scratch? And the latter is more appealing.
Just to be clear, the Celtic Union in this analysis excludes England, is that correct?
Yeah, yes, it's England, Ireland, probably a single Ireland at the rate we're going with, and Wales if they want in as a
You
trade
mean
bloc.
Scotland, not England, right?
Yeah, everybody but England, basically.
Yeah, okay,
Sorry.
right. Okay. Paul, you've raised your hand. You have every right to interrupt. Go.
In terms of personal experiences,
yeah,
or in terms of the Celtic Union.
Well, whatever you raise your hand for, I was going to come back and re-invite the hand raisers to raise their hands, but I'm assuming, did you want to jump in on something that had just been said?
Well, both. I suppose personal experiences. I think the most defining thing for many people in Ireland over the past 5 years has been the anxiety and the heightened political tensions that Brexit caused. And just the trauma of the past 5 years for many people, and the nights where they couldn't get sleep because they weren't sure what was going to happen yet, and the apparent lack of appreciation across the Irish Sea, I think, has been the most defining thing over the past 5 years. And I think what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is a slow dawning or a slow realization in Britain as to what this whole thing was about in the first place. And it was about the Good Friday Agreement. It was about protecting Ireland, at the same time, Ireland's place in the single market. And that really has defined the whole outcome of Brexit, really. And I think we're now seeing the outworkings of that in practical terms. People are beginning to understand how important the border was and why, for example, these sort of checks that are causing such an issue now couldn't be placed on a road border. We have over 100 border crossings on the island of Ireland. And the amount of arguing and the amount of easy solutions that were proposed. I remember interviewing Theresa Villiers, who was Northern Secretary on the day of the Brexit referendum, the day after, the day of the result. And I asked her, what are you going to do about the border? And she says, oh, technology will sort all that. And that was as far as the answer went. And I think we're now seeing what Brexit really means.
Thank you very much. Let's try quickly. Let me invite those who raised their hands earlier to do so again. And we'll just hear quickly from some of them. Tess, go first. And Alexandra, I saw your hand was up. Anyway, but Tess first, please.
Hi, Giles. Yes, so personal experience is absolutely seeing things that I ordinarily order from Germany not being shipped anymore. But I do also...
How do you find out about that? You get a note from the shipper saying it's not available, or it just doesn't...
They say we're no longer shipping to the UK.
Such as?
What I buy from them?
Yeah. Really?
What?
No,
it's called Manufactum. It's a horribly sort of it's a beautiful German site that sells very finely engineered pencil sharpeners and things like that. Just I can't be admitting I buy my stationery from Germany anyway, but I do. Then I was just on that whole sort of pet passporting, traveling. I just think we haven't, COVID is obviously suppressing a lot of normal activity, and people's personal experiences won't really start kicking in until we start trying to travel, holiday, visit. Yeah. It's going to be a very different experience. We've already seen sort of the shenanigans in Spain about people being allowed to return back to Spain with what they consider to be the correct paperwork, and that all snarling up. So I think we've got sort of the luck that, we're doing this under the cover of COVID darkness to a certain extent. We haven't even really begun to feel the personal impact of it.
Right.
So very interesting over the summer.
Indeed.
So takes that.
Thank you. Ellen?
Yeah, hi. Well, on the more sort of superficial end, I guess, Tessa, I admit I also buy some of my stationery from Germany, and I've also seen that that's now no longer being imported. But on the more sort of real end, as Paul was saying, for me, I was living in the EU a couple of years ago, and the anxiety of it, of not knowing my situation, my partner is an EU citizen, not knowing what we should do to ensure that we could eventually live in the same country, was a massive factor. And that's in my decision to eventually come back to the UK. So, in terms of our employment status, our residency status, it was so up in the air for so long that the only way to actually make sure we could live in the same country was perhaps slightly counterintuitively to actually come back to the UK, where his employer would definitely support him. He could apply for pre-settled status. And, then we were making decisions ourselves. So the anxiety there was a huge factor. Yeah.
So to an extent, I don't want to put words into your mouth. The deal must have in some way lessened that anxiety, or was it all you'd already found a way around it before any deal was reached? Obviously. Yeah,
I think because we didn't know what was going to happen for so long.
Right.
We took the decision. We could, by coming back to the UK and his employer supporting him applying for settled status before we would have crashed out, or the end of the transition period. We took the decision into our own hands.
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot. Yasmin, you've got your hand up.
Hiya. Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of think about what COVID results and what's happening because of Brexit. But I've got a residency in Paris that's been in the works for a couple of years now, and I'm meant to be traveling. It was initially meant to start in February, but because of COVID, dates have changed and so on. But also because of Brexit, my partner can no longer. Sorry about the horn in the background.
Don't worry.
Can no longer travel, and the visa sort of system, not like I went in to get my visa for France, a work visa, and people within the actual embassy or at least the contact center seemed very unsure about sort of the various rules and so on. There was like one person that knew things for everyone, and yeah, I think it's definitely a case of things still being sorted out. And also similarly, I've got loads of things that have been returned to the original like stationery and so on that I've ordered.
Well, I'm seeing a theme here on stationery. My goodness, eyes wide open. I recommend Sainsbury's, guys. But just to be clear, this work visa that you now need for France, that would have been a formality or not necessary at all, absent Brexit?
It wouldn't have been. So I needed one because I'm not a British citizen, but my partner wouldn't have needed one.
Okay.
And now there's no way, he can't come on my visa. And also because he doesn't have a sponsor or anything like that, he's probably not going to be able to come, essentially.
And they weren't sure in the embassy either. Fascinating. Okay. I'd like to come back to Maddy if I can, because we've heard some anecdotal impressions of the reality of Brexit in these first 2 weeks. But one of the things that you looked at in your initial analysis was, I hope I'm not conflating two separate things, an undertaking not to discriminate. Sorry, your case study here was in relation to lawyers. So what is your, you said there was this undertaking, but nonetheless, as things stood, there was a hard and fast refusal in the EU to allow UK lawyers to advise on EU law. So what I'd like is your impression of where we are in terms of mutual recognition of professional qualifications, because for tens of thousands of people, that's a huge issue, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking back to the case study you mentioned, but yeah, no, I mean, I think so. I guess that the sort of broader position on mutual recognition of professional qualifications is that there isn't going to be a sort of blanket recognition, which is what the UK initially wanted, and where the two sides would agree to sort of continue to recognise those professional qualifications. So we're talking about accountants, architects, lawyers, and those sorts of professions, and that's sort of something that isn't included in the agreement. What we've instead got is sort of a framework where within the context of the agreement, the two sides can agree in certain areas. They can sort of decide to build up a sort of broader mutual recognition agreement from that basis, which is basically what you've got in the Canada EU agreement. Sorry if I'm not explaining it very well, but so basically what it means then is that for most people, they need to look at what the rules are in specific member states if they're going to go and sort of work there and deliver services there, and that's sort of the thing that's, I think, very difficult and quite difficult for a lot of people to get their heads around, is that previously you could just go into the EU and deliver many services because we have free movement rights, and actually the removal of free movement rights, it's not sort of, oh, there's now one rule for the EU, there is one rule in each individual member state. So you need to be aware of where you're going to practice. And there was some sort of, there were some provisions, some agreement for UK lawyers about practicing UK law in the EU. But again, certain member states could decide to opt out from that provision. So it's one of those areas that you've basically got to very much check what each member state sort of says and allows before you go there. I don't know, Raoul, you might be able to add something on that if you think I've missed anything in terms of those provisions. I don't know.
Let's go to Raoul on that.
Sorry, putting you on the spot now.
So what we have is sector by sector or industry by industry and country by country. So what used to be a blanket permit to sell, I'm sorry, we didn't have a services agreement, did we? Either way, it's complicated. On professional qualifications, Raoul, do you see it getting just steadily more complicated, or is it possible that Germany might sort of take the lead and everyone will follow that lead?
So I think two things I'd add to what Maddy said. The first is we have the Withdrawal Agreement, which provides protections for workers who are already using their qualifications in the EU. So it's more about the flow of workers in the future than the stock, I guess. So that does help. And certainly, so if you're someone who has been living in the EU and is using a qualification there, that continues to be recognised. Or if you've even been using it in an ad hoc basis and it's been recognised by the authority in question, it should continue to be fine. The second point I'd say is, yes, I think we will see this patchwork springing up, and hopefully quite quickly, but there is also a footnote in the mutual recognition section of the agreement which says that the whole section can be superseded by a future agreement in this area. So, it depends how you read that, but it is possible that, if we start to see a rapid patchwork emerging, that could then turn into something more significant. I wouldn't get ahead of ourselves and saying that, suddenly they're going to agree something comprehensive, but it's interesting that that's in there and it's not in a lot of other places in the agreement. So it gives some hope. And I think this is probably, of a lot of the areas, one of the most likely where we will see marginal improvements in the not too distant future.
Not marginal improvements, not just on the status quo right now, but on the status quo ante.
In what sense? Sorry.
Well, if there was a broad agreement on mutual recognition of qualifications, for example, would that be something that we didn't have before?
No, in the EU we had full mutual recognition, so it would be sort of getting close to replicating what we had before.
Okay, no further than that. What about more broadly? There was no single market in services pre-2016, pre-2020. Services accounted for 80% of the UK economy. Is it possible, and this actually alludes to a more general question that I wanted to put to you. Is it possible that we could inch our way incrementally, ad hoc, to something like to a better situation for British services exports than existed pre-2016 in the EU?
So, look, I think you're right that the single market in services was never complete, but it varies service to service to some extent. The first thing to say is financial services was very much a single market, and that has changed quite significantly because it's a heavily regulated service. I think similar is true to an extent of legal services, because that was quite regulated as well. And then audit and accounting, you also had some additional sort of regulatory integration. So the more heavily regulated services tend to be slightly more integrated, but broadly, there were still national restrictions in terms of services provisions. Of course, what we see now is that huge list of restrictions is sort of copied over into the agreement and probably added to, and so there are greater restrictions in terms of providing services. As I think Maddy was sort of touching on, a lot of the services were provided by people moving around. Even though we were in the EU, a lot of services provision was someone doing fly-in, fly-out services, and that has of course come much more difficult because of the end of free movement, and you now have to deal with the national work permit regime of every individual country. There are some mobility requirements, mobility provisions, in the trade agreement that allow you to fly in for 90 days out of every 180 and be a business traveller, but they're quite limited in terms of what you can do under those provisions. So you can go to meetings, you can go to conferences, exhibitions, you can even do some after sales work and I think some repairs and things like that. But what you can't do is generally a service provision and broadly any direct paid work. So they're quite limited in how much those provisions help. So overall, it is a step down from where we were, but I think in those services that aren't heavily regulated, what we do see is that unless there is a national restriction, you can probably still provide them cross-border. So ironically, in some areas where you may previously have moved a person that to provide the service, it's now become more difficult, but actually you could still provide that service from the UK, provided there's no national restriction. So one thing I have in mind there is consulting or advisory. For someone like me as a consultant, I may previously have flown into a country and provided the service on the ground for that client, but if I'm currently advising them from the UK and there's no national restriction, I might be able to do that from my home virtually. Right. So, there are still things that can work. I'm not sure if I've explained it very well, but it sort of drives home that it is complicated.
Yeah.
I think stepping back and answering your bigger question of can this, will this be improved? I think on the margin, but in the end, I don't see many big improvements or deepening of the services section, because unless you have free movement of people or start alignment of rules, I think it's very hard to see a big jump in that. So I think we might see some marginal improvements in areas such as mutual recognition of professional qualifications. You could see some reservations being removed over time, but I think mainly, the improvements will be quite minimal and on the edge.
All right, thank you. Emma, very briefly, if you please, and then I'm going to come back to Paul.
I just wanted to mention, Giles, sort of on the flip side of that. So I actually reached out to our lawyers in the last week or so looking for advice, because we had a couple of people that were still abroad.
Emma's at Tortoise, by the way.
Still abroad at the moment, working in countries where they do have dual nationality. And interestingly, our lawyers were very reluctant to offer us advice. So they were very much, they need to come home, because there are various things that can happen. You can become liable for additional taxes or social security payments, but they weren't clear on that. And they were, you need to seek advice from a local lawyer in whatever country it was. Now, obviously that's quite complicated. And then you've got to pay for another counsel here and another counsel in this country. And I just thought it was interesting. Whereas before, and I'm not saying it's their fault, but they were like, no, this is our basic advice. They need to come home. If they want to do that, you need to seek local legal advice. And also there used to be a certificate that you could apply for people to work in another country in the EU. And they were like, you could apply for one of those, but we don't actually know whether it will still be valid after, from the 1st of Jan. And actually we've been told from the government, etc., we probably won't have that advice until the end of February. We won't have clarity on that.
Right.
So I just think from that side of things as well, I think it's made it quite difficult for those sort of professionals even to, they're a bit more reluctant because they don't know
where they stand.
And they haven't had the guidance to give to us. So then you can't really make a decision and you can't really advise your employees properly because it's just not very clear.
Thanks, Emma. Yes. We're already a minute over, but I did want to come back to Paul finally with a general question. And this is not meant to be politically loaded, but does the island of Ireland, already feel a shade more united since the 31st of December?
I think that's obvious to anyone who's paying attention. The fact that you have a part of the United Kingdom which is still within the EU single market. Obviously, there's a very clear difference there. But the island of Ireland, for various reasons, has been somewhat unique down through the years. We have a different animal health regime. Indeed, one of the reasons why ports in Northern Ireland were able to prepare for this new regime was that they already carried out checks in Belfast and Larne on cattle and so on coming onto the island from Britain. And so essentially what you have now is, we used to check animals. Now, instead of checking the cow, we check the lasagna. That's the difference. So yes, this definitely feeds into a developing political narrative. There's more talk about a border poll, as it's known. That would be a vote in Northern Ireland as to whether it remains part of the United Kingdom or whether it reunites with the rest of the island. And you see that in Dublin newspapers. For example, the Irish Times recently have been debating the merits of a united Ireland. And certainly nationalism in Northern Ireland has been emboldened by Brexit, in the sense that they say this shows the difficulties of having two jurisdictions on the island. The last 5 or 6 years of torturous debate about how we get through Brexit was a simple reality of having partition here. So yeah, it does feed into that. And unionists in the north certainly, I think, are more anxious about their place within the United Kingdom, and they haven't been slow to say that either. So this will undoubtedly play into the debate about a united Ireland. And Sinn Féin, for example, which is a growing force on the island, have been calling for a border poll. They say that the time is right to have a border poll. The Irish government's official position is this isn't the correct time to have a border poll. They've set up what they call a shared island unit, which looks at relationships across the island. So I think you'll see over the next 10 years, certainly, this having a significant effect on the debate.
Thank you so much, Paul. In a sense, I mean, definitely a big enough subject for future thinkings, and we will, I'm sure, have them, but not a separate subject. Thank you all very much, Raoul, Maddy, Paul, all the speakers. I'm sorry that there were some that we couldn't get to, and it's been very busy in the chat. There comes a point when I failed to notice it flying by. 71 messages that I haven't had a chance to look at. Thank you all for joining in. I take away on trucks and borders, we're very much still in a wait and see situation. A lot of people not wanting to test the waters for fear that they are murkier than they'll be able to deal with. Paul's point on Northern Ireland being still in the single market is a simple one, but I think important to bear in mind, especially the notion that a lot of people in Great Britain simply haven't come to terms with that yet, especially including people who are used to shipping across the Irish Sea. And finally, Raoul's point, reinforced by what Maddy was saying about professional qualifications, it's complicated. We could get back to where we started. We are unlikely in the short term or medium term at any rate to get to a more advantageous position for the service sector on which so much of the UK economy depends. Sorry if that sounds gloomy, but there are times when I think one just has to face facts. Thank you all very much. There was something cheerful that I was going to offer you to head off for the weekend. There's been a lot of snow in the Alps, but we can't enjoy it. Thank you all very much. Join us again next Friday for Sensemaker Live. And until then, stay safe. Bye-bye.